Alright, Napoleon a day. So, it's operational in an era where not many people have done operational games. You'll see more of them nowadays with a couple of weird sort of situations in them. Some of them are based on this system. For example, the Red Sash stuff is All Is Lost Save Honor, which I really kind of enjoyed, actually. But I was able to give that a lot of in-depth look in a way that usually with the Zucker games I tend not to. The strange thing about this one, out of all the older ones, this is the one I enjoy always. And I'm trying to figure out the why of that. Because 1809, I remember, with the discipline of Victory Games, and it was probably the first that I had to deal with, but I'm not sure. I may have had Struggle of Nations first. It should have been a very good game. Unfortunately, the campaign ended up too much about sort of slogging across one river, trying to find your way across one river. And that wasn't a lot of fun. Now, for me, it came down too much trying to deploy your pontoon bridges and this, that, and the other. Something that Zucker pays attention to that I don't think many other games really do. In this game, I had them, I never used them, which might be a mistake if you think about it, because the Bohemian army, for example, in the south, could have actually breached the line using their pontoon bridges, and I never even thought about doing it. I had other routes to follow where I didn't have to try and force a river that way. And so that may be the big advantage between this and 1809. The advantage between this and Struggle of Nations, which is the other one that I had from back in the day, I didn't have this one, was that, well, Struggle of Nations had much, much worse rolls. Many, many more errors. Looking at the format of the rolls, I suspect both this and Struggle are actually pretty close to the OSG rolls. The thing is, I didn't know about the existence of OSG at all. So any of the... I'm sure he put out other games under that OSG label that are now getting reprinted, etc. And any of those I was just completely unfamiliar with. There were two big problems with Struggle of Nations. One was the rules were the worst that I've seen in the series, and among my stars for worst rules ever. Now, one of the reasons for that, and this is why I suspect that actually Avalon Hill did get their hand in it, is that they put errata in the back of the rolls, the printed rolls, as questions and answers. So there'd be questions like, gee, Dumarov comes in at hex 3907. Is this correct? No, it's not correct. He should be at 3905. No, that's not what questions and answers are for. Anyway, that's one big minus for the Struggle of Nations. The other is I had that board, and that was one of the first one-piece boards I had, or as with this, two one-piece hard stock boards. And it wouldn't lie flat. None of these do. I mean, I had to put a lot of weight on top of this for a day to get it to lay flat enough. And then you kind of shove it together and hold it together, and it'll eventually kind of not be too bad. But that one was one of my first, and I followed the SPI idea of what you do with a paper map. And I kind of pushed against the edges. And you really do have to do this. You just have to have the perfect amount of force. And ended up snapping my board into many pieces. And it became perhaps not quite as unplayable as it was just out of the package, but unplayable all the same. Anyway, this one I knew better. You know, this didn't happen to me with Civilization, which was actually the first game I had that kind of board with, because, you know, Civilization wasn't necessary to get the board to lay exactly flat. These it is, and Struggle of Nations perhaps more than any other, because it has tiny, tiny little hexes and pieces that are slivers of this. Beyond that, though, this is a really, really interesting campaign to play. You have an incredibly effective still French army and command structure, but without enough force to just overwhelm the enemy. On the other hand, you have very clearly defined objectives that are easy to visualize, and it doesn't take all that much effort to start figuring out what you need to do in this situation. What's so beautiful about the operational in this era, you don't have that sort of, oh, I can cover every other hex lightly and this, that, and the other. And, you know, between stacking limitations and the size of the board area, that all just kind of determines how spread out I am. No, you have actual little forces, and not just a single stack that's plowing through everything, but little integrated, interdependent forces that you need to move forward, and you need to protect your supply lines. You maybe have to leave some garrisons behind to guard a river crossing or whatever. And it's just really this very pleasant way of visualizing what was happening. And what was happening visualizes more pleasantly because of how it's represented here. There are agonizing choices, though, in this game, and usually that's not something I like. I did not mind it. Again, maybe because of the particulars of this campaign, the fluidity of being able to shift the Prussian army from the East Front over to the northern sector, and stuff like that. It just, there are so many cool things about it that those agonizing decisions and those kind of, I zoom in real close and make a decision based on counting the hexes and all that. All of that works for me in this in a way that I probably grump about it in other games. And it's hard for me to really put my finger down on what is going on there. Now, the series is similar across all the games, up until maybe some point. I don't know, because I haven't played as most modern ones. They have cards and things in them, and I don't know what role they play. But one really cool thing in this rule book, let's talk about the components. So, other than the map, we'll get to the rule book as part of this. This map actually presents the information better than, say, the 6 Days of Glory map did, the Barber map, which I could barely read. This really kind of jams the information of the roadways, the rivers, and everything right in your face and says, deal with it. And you have to. You have to be able to fully understand the map to play this game. The player aids of these cards are kind of interesting. For some unknown reason, the different major generals are scrambled in. And in addition, the generals are placed sort of near the guy they start the campaign near. You know, so like Schwarzburg and Württemberg are near each other. There's no reason they would stay near each other, particularly throughout the game. You do have an allied sheet for each of the two armies, although even those aren't absolute in terms of what stays where. There's some potential for moving commanders between armies in certain cases. One thing that helps a little with the Allied side is putting the Major General's name, as it were, in really bold type. And that would be kind of cool with some of the other generals too, but, well, some of them they have pictures, some of them you can't really even tell that they're Major Generals, or that they're not Major Generals, because, you know, they just have a little track like this. Keeping the values on the tracks is a little disturbing, because as a player you don't instantly know what forces you have available by just looking on the map. On the other hand, it helps provide a greater fog of war type element to the game. Your enemy can't go look at your chart, so all he sees is really one counter on the board. And if you play with the dummies and the hidden leader names and stuff like that, you actually end up with a pretty solid fog of war to this game. Maybe more solid than you should, which is why he adds vedettes and stuff like that to the other games when it got later. Now the French organization display is a little different. First of all, it doesn't have those major generals called out boldly, so they're harder to see. And secondly, well, I guess that's really the key thing here. Also, in playing with these, you have to constantly be counting up how many units you have in a given hex. That's not always obvious because you'll have subordinate leaders, and what your command value is. So there's a lot of counting on that. There's also going to be a lot of counting on the map when you're counting between your center of operations and particular units to see if they're in command, and then also where to set your center of operations so that it optimizes the charts and tables. Speaking of which, a couple of charts and tables, one for each player. They're in the back of the book. You have to remove them from the book in the original game. Photocopy obviously works. I didn't find the rules to be that necessary as a reference constantly, which is a good sign. We'll get to why that's the case. But so I was able to use these charts just having them on the back of the rules, but there's copies online that you can print out if you need to. The rules themselves, I like the layout for this rule book. First things first, he opens up with this general course of play, and boy does that help. I understand much of the Zucker design at this point, so it's not that big a deal. But reading this, I realize this is what any game that's a little different from the norm should have. It should spell out, and by the norm, I don't know what I mean, okay? Once upon a time, that was easy. 1970s hex encounter, you know, locking zones, blah, 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 whatever. But any game that tries to seriously model a situation probably needs something like this for you to kind of understand what it is that you do. And I've seen some games, I think Unconditional Surrender actually does this. Some more modern games have taken this attitude up, but most games just don't bother. They start off with a glossary of terms and the counter mix and this, that, and the other, and they don't really tell you what the overall flow of the game is. And this is incredibly helpful when you're facing something that's so different as the Zucker designs are. I looked at Struggle of Nations has this as well, which is why I believe actually what happened there was they took the OSG rulebook, printed it as is, and then slapped some errata in the questions and answers because they didn't want to modify the actual rules as typeset. Maybe they didn't have an easy, way to do that. Whatever. I don't think 1809 had this, and that may actually be one of my complaints about 1809, is that it didn't jump out and say, this is what the game's about, this is what you're going to be doing. And it's very helpful. In my intro, I used this to give the brief overview and then went into depth on it, and that's exactly what it does right in the rules. It gives you this idea of what you're going to be playing, and then the rules start filling that out nicely. There is a significant glossary here, but it's not a glossary of things like, I don't know, just acronyms that you're trying to explain and stuff. It's issues of the game, and it goes into some detail explaining them. Again, adding to your knowledge before you dive into the rules. Very good idea there. Okay. As to the sequence of play, look, this is a standard Zucker, but it's more stripped down than some of the others. And I think that's actually some of why it's appealing to me. There's less special, specific little rules that you have to worry about with this one. And I don't even mean, I mean system rules. Things like, I'm an all-cav force, I have +1 to initiative. Those things add to the simulation value of the game, but they also add to the burden in terms of the rules you have to remember and the things that you're more likely to have to make lookups on. And I found this, I didn't feel that necessity to have lookups for it. So, as usual, you start off, you generate some administrative points, you're allowed to reorganize your forces. Your actual movement, you have this, and this is one of the agonizing choices. Do you spend a command point to move something, or do you take a chance? If it's a crappy leader with a low initiative, you spend the command point, or a major general or something, if you need it done. But what if it's Napoleon, and you have a 1 in 6 chance of failing to get there? Oh, man. Oh, I gotta take that chance, you know? And that could undermine your entire plan for a turn. You could just be completely hosed, and you could end up, if you do it poorly, you could end up stranding someone, you know, an important force, because you decided to chance something there. And we had that happen a couple of times. The interplay between operations or activities points that you have to spend to activate your units and the attrition is really where it makes this decision tough. Because, you know, if they're just action points, they're just commands of some sort that you're building up somehow, hey, no big deal, right? But you've got all the supply infrastructure and everything tied up with these. I'm not sure how much I agree with that. I kind of feel like there may be a little bit too much abstraction going on there. But in terms of a play choice, it really makes it tough to spend these points. At least until you've got some overage of the maximum attrition level, you know, bonus that you can get. What's kind of nice here is for combat itself, then after you have these, you know, choices as to your movement and what you want to activate and what you want to roll for, your enemy has this reaction phase. And again, that the nature of the era and the way it's represented, it's required. You'll see even in CDGs that they have interceptions or something like that, area-based games. They'll have interceptions to kind of try to add to this, to try to allow for the same sort of thing. Because what happened was troops would be marching and they would not really know where the enemy was. No air scouting here. It was all done with cav and at fairly short distance, or else you couldn't get word back. So that uncertainty is baked into this, being able to roll for initiative to see if you can run in and help one of your force, you know, one of your forces that's under attack, or in the same way to pull your units out. And there's this nice little, it's not just, you know, like CDGs tend to do, oh yeah, you just roll against your initiative and see if you make it, and then you just go in. No, it actually is a comparison in many cases between the active and the inactive player. So if you're trying to get away from someone, sometimes it's hard to withdraw from a battle. Sometimes you're in a position where you just can't afford to get away. Well, then you make a comparison between how well your commander, you know, is able to slip away to how much the other guy is able to inhibit your movement. and maybe you don't get away. You know, it's not simply, oh yeah, I'm a two initiative, so I need a 1 or a 2. No, it works a little bit into, you know, how the inactive player's leader is trying to prevent you from doing that. Combat itself is fairly simple. I have my doubts that it completely accurately represents everything. There are times where I feel like, you know, I've got really good odds against somebody. I should be able to destroy them or at least do more damage to them right in the battlefield itself without a pursuit. That's not the case in the game. If you were to add the kind of rules that I think would appropriately, you know, cause the damage, it would be a more mechanically complex game. I don't think it would have to be terribly more, I don't think it would require a lot more rules, because all you'd have to really do is put casualties for both sides and a retreat result. And then the retreat result generates additional casualties. As it is, though, if you don't pursue, you only, as the victor, you only do as many casualties as hexes you pursue, with a minimum of the amount you took. So you'll always do the same amount of casualties if you win the battle plus, right? If you get a success there. Let's see if there's anything exciting I really want to talk about. So this game has a serious mental mechanical cost to it, burden, whatever. One of the things is, when you're looking through the charts, I've already talked about most of these issues, when you're looking through the charts, finding the right leaders and making sure that everything's allowed to be stacked together, because that's not always clear, and that the command that you think you have can actually be commanded by the general who's in charge, and situations like that. There's also a large amount of counting in terms of distance from the center of operations. That's probably the biggest mental mechanical aspect to it, other than getting the game set up. Yeah, I didn't talk about this. So this scenario booklet is pretty suspect. It doesn't really support the game very much. It is the bare minimum. You have basically a table that tells you when all the reinforcements come in. You have a little bit of rules about the scenarios here, and you know, some point values that they start with. And then you go into what amounts to nearly 30 pages of well, no, there's significant other pages here. But you end up with over 20 pages of text reproduced from somewhere else with maps that kind of link it to the game, without really a lot of discussion that has anything to do with the game, except for the topic. That's interesting, but you can find your history elsewhere. I like there to be a strong historical basis in the game, but it feels like the scenarios are given short shift here, and in particular since there's errata to them. And then you have this, which is not clearly explained in the same way that maybe the other systems in the game are, which determines where everything sets up at any given time. And the problem is these things with X's, some of them are reinforcements that are marked down on the map. You do not know what the strength points are without looking to the next scenario and seeing how many strength points there are there. You kind of feel like, I don't know, that probably doesn't fully represent all possibilities. You know, they could just say reinforcement the hex and what strength points are coming in, and presumably what leader they're under and whatever, if they're under a leader. which they aren't always. Some of them are coming in as major generals. You can work your way through that if you grab the errata. And if you don't grab the errata, you can kind of fake it, which I did somewhere in between. I marked some of the stuff down, and not all of it. Terrain has very little effect on combat in the game. You're not looking at, basically there are two choices of what terrain does. There's a movement effect for terrain that's pretty standard. Hey, you look it up on the chart and see how far you move. But the concept is, does the defender get an advantage from this terrain or not? And if the defender gets an advantage, they basically get a column shift on the combat table. It's just this affecting versus non-affecting. The odds table maybe feels like it's a little too coarsely grained, but on the other hand, it keeps you from having to calculate out 3 to 2, 5 to 4, 7 to 3, whatever. 6 Days of Glory, I found, took it a little further than I would like. I don't mind there being a 3 to 2 in there, though. That might help a little bit. But much more than that, I wouldn't even consider. You have a retreat before combat, which is done through the regular initiative fashion. Basically, if somebody's attacking me, I have the ability to make that roll for initiative, modified by their ability to interfere with my initiative, and just leave. Retreat after combat is, like I said, how you determine the casualties. The victory for this particular game is kind of interesting in that, basically, if Napoleon can rack up enough victories, he wins the game. And if he starts taking too many defeats or starts losing cities, he loses the game. His goal is either to win the automatic victory, and it's not the easiest thing because the track is balanced in his disfavor, or to hold out. However, like I said, he's got a bunch of good leaders, a good command system early in the game, when the coalition doesn't really have that. So I was able to find in my playthrough, with some rules errors and such not, that Napoleon was able to basically defeat the coalition and probably get to better terms. Better play might have meant that the coalition played a little bit more carefully, didn't open themselves up to as many examples. What's kind of weird about it is that Napoleon has to win by 2 sort of in a battle to score a positive point. And if he doesn't, he scores a negative point. There's one particular edge case I really don't like, and maybe it's covered in the errata, which is if the coalition just throws 1-point units at Napoleon, they can knock him down to lose the game very quickly. And there's a cost to it, but the game would clearly end in Napoleon's losses because he could never inflict 2 points more to the enemy. Anyway, you get a lot of stuff in this game, in the Avalon Hill version, with the solid board, etc. It ends up completely filling the box to such a degree that they couldn't even fit a die in the game. So you gotta supply your own dice with this one. It's very heavy. Struggle of Nations, same position. They lucked out in being able to fit everything in these boxes because there really, literally is no extra room in them. Overall, this is the one I have enjoyed the most. It has done something kind of cool for me, which is encouraged me more. See, I bought some of his other more recent designs. They went on sale, really big sale, a couple of years back, and I said, you know, he's so well regarded, I've got to give it a shot. And I see why he's well regarded. It's because you have this war of maneuver and not a lot of pieces, not a lot of mechanical complexity to the game, but a lot of decision making and sort of the big ideas about sweeping an attack. Playing these games is like looking at those maps that show you the maneuvers on them, right? It's not like ASL would be the obvious counterexample to this, where, you know, every little detail is being covered. Now, but on the other hand, well, not on the other hand. This is something that I'm not sure that I particularly see as a positive, because if I'm not enjoying it to the degree that I enjoy Napoleon at Bay, and Lee versus Grant's another example of a good one, that everything just kind of fell together for me on. Not a Zucker design. This is different designer. I don't remember who did Lee versus Grant. I want to say Butterfield, but or Belkowski. But what's strange is how closely run you can play very similar, the same system. So 6 days just, I felt confused by it, and I wasn't enjoying the situation at all. This one, first time I played it, I enjoyed it. Certainly this time I enjoyed it. It just feels so much cleaner, and it's a weird, I can't quite put my finger on why, except that, you know, the campaign is a particularly interesting one. The system seems to support the things that the campaign it tries to show very well, and the components support it, which is a big deal. Especially the map. You give me that Barber map, and I can't understand what's going on. I forgot to mention one thing about the components here, speaking of which. The counters for this one suck. I mean, the infantry units, it's hard to read which particular, or the individual unit counters, the infantry cav, whatever. It's hard to read which individual commander is in charge of them, unless you have perfect lighting, and by perfect I mean really bright right on it with a magnifying glass. The leader counters look like they've been particularly designed with the decision to try to make them as obfuscated as possible. Tiny little print, not using much of the counter at all. Really, really a bad design choice there. But, you know, once you have the pieces on the board, it's usually not too hard. It's the setup that becomes difficult to arrange, and there's already enough problems with the setup. So the setup's the big negative to this game, and that's where a decent amount of the errata actually sits. All right, let's send this one up. Back to GBOH, I think.